Now that we understand that our objective of our first scheduled interaction is to qualify our prospective customer, we now need to develop some criteria for how we qualify our prospective customer. And to do that, we're going to create our ideal customer target. Like an archery target, your bullseye is in the middle and you're less accurate as you move out from the center. In developing your ideal customer target, there are 6 major areas that I like to look at and define as criteria for qualifying my prospective customers. The first is business. So the first criteria underneath business that I like to look at is what type of business. Now, I'm not quite yet talking about industry. What I'm talking about specifically is, are they a for-profit business or are they a non-profit business? When you think about the difference between for-profit businesses and non-profit businesses, there definitely are some significant factors involved, both in what kind of sites you're going to be building, but also just kind of their work style and what's important to them. A lot of people think that nonprofits are just businesses that file under a different tax code, but there's certain things that nonprofits have to be worried about that businesses don't. For instance, volunteers. Typically, a lot of people don't volunteer for a lot of for-profit businesses, so that's just one example of how these different types of organizations are different. So thinking about whether you want to work with a for-profit business or a non-profit business, that's what I consider type. The second criteria under business would be how many years has this business been established? So typically, I would want to work with businesses that had been established for at least 5 years. This usually told me that these businesses were revenue generating and that their business model had been proven. This is a big deal for me because when I work with these businesses, it was a lot less difficult to convince them to invest in their online business, and it was a lot less difficult to convince them to pay some good money for it. A lot of early businesses or startups are pretty strapped for cash and they don't have the budget to hire a professional firm to come in and help them with their website. Another great criteria under business would be actual revenue. So sometimes it's difficult to find this answer out from a business, but a lot of times we can get a general idea of how much revenue a business is doing. A lot of times if they have some kind of bricks and mortar establishment or they have employees, you can see they have a general idea of how much overhead they have. You can get an idea of how much revenue the business is doing. A lot of times it's good just to ask, how much revenue do you do per year? And that way you can get an idea of what kind of budget they have and whether or not they'd be a good fit for you. Another great criteria would be how many employees a business has. This is also an indicator of how big of a team you might end up be working with, or it might give you an idea if the company is not willing to disclose revenue of about how much the business currently makes based on the size of their team, how many employees they have, do they have a management team, what types of people are you going to be working with. And finally, what industry or market is the business in? Sometimes it can be helpful to only work with clients that are in a specific niche market. For example, our agency works with a lot of restaurant clients. So I would typically go out and work to target restaurant clients, and sometimes when we'd get new prospective customers in that weren't fitting the restaurant market, I would usually pass on them or hopefully have other criteria to grade if they would be a good fit for our business or not. But if a restaurant client did want to work with us, then that was usually a good indicator that we were a good fit because we had a lot of experience in that niche. Our second major criteria is market. So even though looking at the market that the business is in is an important part of your decision-making criteria, it's important to also look at the actual market that the business operates in. And I'm not just talking about the industry here. I'm talking about really what specific competitive market they're in. So for instance, how much competition is currently in this market? For example, if you were to try to work with plastic surgeons in Florida, that might be really, really competitive. If you're going to try to sell any kind of search optimization or any kind of marketing services to this potential customer, you might find that it's a really uphill battle to get any real results for the customer because they're in a really highly competitive market. So it's really good to look at the general competition of the market of your customer that you're potentially going to work with. Another factor is niche. So how niche is your customer? Do they have a really generic offering or do they have a very specific offering within their market? So that's also something to look at. So let's say, for instance, I was looking at a restaurant and a potential restaurant wanted to work with us and they were just a generic kind of like pizza and burger joint. and they didn't really have anything about them that made them unique or special. Well, I might consider passing on that project because I liked clients that were more independent, unique restaurant concepts that really had some kind of edge over their local competitive market. So I always liked my customers to have a certain niche hold on part of the market. And finally, when looking at market, there's a big difference between business to business and business to consumer. So it's important to think about where your customer is in that space. I know a lot of web companies only make websites for business to consumer type sites or retail or e-commerce type sites. And I know a lot of web companies that only do business to business type sites and work for that specific market type. So thinking about our overall market is really important. This is another major criteria in thinking about your ideal customer. The third major criteria on our list is geography. For instance, when thinking about geography, you might only want to work with prospective customers that are local to your business. Oftentimes, local is easier to work with because you can actually meet face-to-face with your customer and you don't have to pay for a plane ticket to go visit them. A big part of how we grew our agency was working with clients that were in our own backyard. Now granted, over time, we expanded our base to work with some more national and international customers, but you always have to recognize that working with customers cross-country or across the world is more difficult. It can be harder to establish convenient meeting times when you're working across time zones, and also it can be more difficult to get more people involved in a meeting when people are spread out across the world. You also might be thinking about customers on a more national level, or even international level. Oftentimes, you don't have to necessarily specify that you only work with customers in a specific geographic area, but sometimes it can help you in how you're approaching your marketing efforts. For instance, if you only wanted to work with local companies, then you might have much more focused advertising and marketing just on your local area that's around your business. Our fourth major criteria is personality. Personality is a really important factor because once you actually get into a project, you're going to be stuck working with this person for 8, 12, or maybe more weeks than that. And how they work with you will tell you a lot about whether or not you're going to be profitable in your project or whether you're going to keep your sanity. So one of the first signs of this is whether they're willing to work in your process. So as you start unfolding the sales process with them, whether they're willing to schedule meetings with you or whether they're actually willing to give you any kind of research information or answer questions about their business, those are usually good signs of whether or not they're willing to work within your process. If they're not willing to work within your process during the sales process, it's likely that they're going to be a headache when you actually get into your project. Another personality quality to look at is whether or not they're responsive. So does this person even get back to you on time or not? They're not responding to your emails and not answering your phone calls. If they're doing that in the sales process, they're probably going to do that in the project process as well. And finally, on personality, I always recommend to give yourself a good gut check. It's usually a true or false value. Do I want to work with this person, yes or no? And be able to answer that really easily. And don't spend a lot of time on that, but just give them a good gut check. Our fifth criteria is history. The history component is really about your prospective customers' back history with websites, their own website, and their general knowledge of the web industry. The first sub-criteria is whether or not they've made similar investments in web in the past. So have they actually invested money in their existing website, or have they invested money in a project that maybe didn't end up coming to fruition? Questions around their prior investments can give you some insights into what potentially they would be willing to spend on this round of the project and also on how they might end up working with you. Taking a quick assessment of what you think this customer's general knowledge is about websites is also something that's important. I'm not necessarily saying that you don't want to work with customers that have no experience with web or have no knowledge of web, but taking a general understanding of where they're at with their web knowledge will at least allow you to make a decision on whether or not you want to work with that person or with somebody that has that understanding. Also, I'd take a look at what their existing website looks like, and if you can get any clues about how they might work with you by looking at their existing site. I would also ask your prospective customer for any active campaigns they're currently running, either email campaigns, online advertising campaigns, or potentially traditional campaigns. Another important indicator when profiling your customer's history is whether or not they've worked with the web pro before and what might have happened in that relationship. This is a really important thing to maybe deep dive on. So if they've maybe had a web designer that they currently work with and they're potentially looking for another option, or they have a company they worked with in the past, but they fired them, a lot of times when you start to ask and kind of pry into what happened to that relationship, you might find out some interesting clues of whether or not you would want to work with this person moving forward. Now, our final qualification criteria is project specific. So you always want to look at the stated needs of the customer and see if this type of project is a good fit for you or not. A lot of times, stated needs come in the form of some type of requirements document or request for proposal. Another project-based assessment is whether or not they're price sensitive or not. Now, this might be accomplished by simply asking your prospective customer if they have a specific budget or if they had a range that they're trying to keep within, and then gauging that budget that they reactively say to you with what you might consider a good budget for your type of projects. But knowing whenever you talk budget or price early on, like in your very first scheduled interaction, you're probably not going to get a very honest or forthcoming answer. People typically don't want to disclose what kind of budget they really have, but you can typically find an idea. Like let's say, for instance, I want to work with customers that are $5,000 projects or greater. And I ask somebody what kind of budget they had in mind, and they say $300. So I immediately know that person is not my ideal customer, and I'm gonna probably move on from that project. So as you can see, we've got 6 major criteria here: business, market, geography, personality, history, and project. Now, there's a lot of sub-criteria here, but I don't want you to get overwhelmed with all of the categories and the subcategories here. What you're gonna wanna do is get as specific as you possibly can to create your ideal customer, and then what we'll do is craft a handful of questions that you can ask during your qualification meeting, and then we'll basically figure out how close to your target you potentially are, and that way you can decide whether or not you wanna pursue the business in your first qualification meeting.